Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us with Daniel Weyman, one of the stars of the Amazon Studios production, The Rings of Power, which is on at the moment. If you haven't seen it, you should check it out because it's really, really good. It's set in the high fantasy world of J.R. Tolkien, obviously famous for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, which were published in the mid-20th century and have pretty much conditioned fantasy literature since then and have been adapted into films by Peter Jackson. It was in 2023, I think, that season one of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power premiered. One of the biggest shows to ever premiere, right, Daniel?
I think it was. I think we actually premiered the first one 2020 September 2022, and then we started
2022.
filming pretty much. We started filming the second series at that point for another nearly year. Yeah, and then a year of post. So just relaunching season two now. Yeah.
Did you ever envisage yourself starring in such a huge enterprise as The Rings of Power?
I mean, it's like we've all got different parts in us, haven't we? We sort of look after all these different bits of us that need certain things, and certainly one of my parts, I'm sure, loves the idea of being sort of, very important on a world stage. But I think that part's probably the bit that thought it might happen was very small. I think the reality part, the sort of pragmatic part, thought that probably wasn't going to happen for me. But acting is it's such a weird career in that there's no real trajectory. I've worked for over 20 years and, largely done sort of jobbing actor roles, had the occasional nice, really big, meaty part in a theatre show or, a couple of series of British TV things. But it's not something where most of us, I think, just say, yeah, I'm working towards my goal, which is, being a world star or something, or be working with this director or those actors. And for me, when the audition process started for The Rings of Power, there was more than a hint of there's no way they're going to cast me. And so I think, actually, because the casting process was so long, actually, there was a sort of drip feed of beginning. I began to realize, as I think I do with most parts that I play, I began to feel like actually, I would be really good at portraying this role. There was something about this role that matched things in me already, and the aspects where I differed from the character, I was really, really keen to understand how I might find that particular characteristic. So I got to a place, I think, where I felt empowered to play him, and probably I felt, even before I was fully cast, I sort of thought, I got to the stage of thinking, do you know what, this is actually I feel like this is my character, and that's always a good sign, because I think it means that you lose a lot of the self-consciousness about choices, and you feel you can, or I certainly feel that I can sort of play a bit, and I can be malleable with it, and I can respond to directors or writers and other actors, if the way that I'm going isn't how other people have perceived it.
Well, definitely, you did a fantastic job with this character. We won't reveal who it is just yet, even though this will air after the season finale takes place and we get that final reveal. When I received the email from Gracehill Media about this final reveal that would take place, I had my suspicions, of course, of who it might be. But before we get there, I have to ask you this question. Aside from your character, we know it's the stranger, but whose identity is unveiled, who is your absolutely favorite Lord of the Rings character from across the Legendarium? You can choose anybody.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, it's such a big question. I mean, the one that I feel most, because the worlds are so imaginatively involving, because they are immersive and they are sprawling, and you can keep researching and just find yourself deeper and deeper into the Tolkien mythology and legendarium. I think that often gets me into a place where the characters who I most am excited by are not necessarily always the nicest, or the ones that ultimately are going to win out the day. And I think in the case of Lord of the Rings, the Gollum character, the ill-fated Gollum, is I find him phenomenally. It's probably because I find it upsetting what's happened to him, but I also find it mesmerizing to watch. Certainly, his portrayal in the Lord of the Rings films, but also when you read the books, that the ability to switch, the sort of loss of self, or rather the loss of a rooted sense of self within the real landscape. All those things they're so sort of unsettling and unnerving and worrying, and yet he's powerful, and yet he's grotesque, and yet he's pathetic, and we feel sorry for him as well. So it feels like he's got a huge amount of things around him, and then working on our show, I think the Rings of Power, I've really found myself, both through season 1 and season 2, I find Galadriel's portrayal, the way that Morgoth Clark portrays Galadriel, is extraordinary. And I always feel, after watching her episodes, I always feel like I would go into battle for her. Other people sort of don't see that she's flawed, but of course, but we're all flawed, but surely her heart's in the right place. Anyway, it's they're the sort of two I think that would ring out for me.
Well, in terms of the characterization of Galadriel, you see in the Rings of Power a younger Galadriel who is, let's say, on the process to becoming the archetypal feminine, let's say, that we see later on, or that we read about in the Lord of the Rings, and we see in Peter Jackson's adaptations, this kind of exemplification of wisdom and beauty that floors people and brings them to their knees. She certainly has those aspects now, Morphy Clark's representation of her, but this is something about how these characters are nuanced, like Gollum, for example, and can be engaged with on multiple registers is always very interesting. It's the same with your character. Can I evoke the well-worn adage of Celeborn, Galadriel's husband? Is he estranged in this way? She thinks he's dead in the Rings of Power. Tell me, where is Gandalf? For I much desire to speak with him.
I mean, it's an extraordinary thing, isn't it, to get to a place where we've seen all of the experiences of the stranger in Middle Earth. We saw him land. We saw that he didn't know anything from his past. He hasn't really remembered very much. Nothing has really clicked back in, other than his ability to speak and his Quenya. There are a couple of little things, but generally what we've seen is this progression forwards at the time that we understand it, through his experiences in Middle Earth, especially with the Harfoots, and now in the lands of Rune. And so to get to a stage, for me, certainly, I've been with him for 4 years and loving him, like feeling for him very, very deeply, and to get to a stage where others start to respond to him and want to call him by a name, and they begin to come up with something that begins to resonate with him, and he suddenly finds out that's what they're going to call me. They're going to call me Gandalf. Having that moment, I think, is such. I feel so privileged and humbled and honoured that the stranger has got to that stage, because obviously that's the start of a journey that a lot of us will know. There are all sorts of things that we all might feel about the idea of Gandalf, but obviously our version of Gandalf is very, very primitive. That in terms of the thousands of years that this Maya exists in Middle Earth, he has to experience a huge amount before he gets anywhere near that place of the stories later on, in the Third Age. And so if we've seen enough of a germ in him, enough of these seeds of understanding about kindness and truth, and all these really, really important sort of core foundational aspects of his being, to call him, for others to want to call him something that equates to Gandalf. Grand Elf is where they come through, isn't it? But that's
Absolutely.
a really, really humbling thing, and I love the way it came about. That it wasn't him sort of standing there with a staff saying, "I know what I'm going to be called. It's Gandalf." That the way that the showrunners introduced it, I think, is really beautiful, and for me, it perfectly aligns with the character that hopefully this version of Gandalf will grow into.
Look, as I was listening to you, not only did I get a sense of your intimate familiarity with Tolkien's mythology, there, referring to Gandalf as a Maya who becomes an Istar, of course, in his incarnated form in Middle-earth, sent from Valinor to help guide the children of God, Eru Ilúvatar,
Yeah.
to fight against Sauron. All of these things play into the background and are evoked often by the show. So it's faithful to Tolkien's vision, definitely in that respect. In as much as you can be when you're translating it to this medium, film. Obviously, the different mediums. But
Yeah.
so a few things that you said really hit me. The first is in relation to Gandalf receiving his name. How did that strike you in contrast to the characterization of Sauron? Uh, in two ways. First of all, Gandalf being led and guided by the Harfoots, okay, so the
Yeah.
precursors of the halflings and the hobbits, and
Yeah.
Sauron imposing himself insidiously, seductively,
Yeah.
persuading, tempting. Did you think about that contrast at all as you were fleshing out Gandalf's character?
Well, I mean, it's really interesting that, yeah, because I hadn't thought in terms of the name. The naming part of the journey was really at the very end, obviously, for me, for the stranger. This idea that I don't think the stranger was, well, to put it like this, I think that for me, the key thing had always been, from the stranger's point of view, to be going forward, to try and be learning from things, to try and be achieving this purpose, or getting closer to achieving a purpose, finding out what his reason for being here was, and understanding some of that sort of weight of history that he hasn't yet got. And he's largely developed those characteristics, I think, from his interactions with the Harfoots. And
Yeah.
they as teachers to him, they sort of educators, and through their community, have been very sensitive. You know, if you think of them as, if you think of parents and children, their version of sort of parenting this being that is very young and immature and not wise, you know, has been wonderful. They've led by example. They've demonstrated their love. They've demonstrated their warmth. They've modeled what happens when you go through difficulty and try and learn something from it and come out the other side. So he's had all these lessons, and I think he's trying to follow that sort of route. But all alongside that, he's had this understanding. And just as you asked the question, it was crystallizing for me that it's been less about names and more about energies within the landscape. So for him, I think he felt, when he was sort of kicked out of the Harfoots encampment in the end of the first season, because he broke the tree and it nearly killed Nori's sister, what he was feeling then at that time, as the volcano exploded somewhere else in Middle Earth, you know, was through the earth. It was the way that the energy in the earth was vibrating. It was the darkness, the metaphorical darkness that was moving in the earth and in the air and in the sky, not just in obvious ways of light or in weather, but more in terms of the way that the friction of molecules and particles was vibrating, and how some of that can sometimes make us feel joyful, but some can make us feel terrified and unsettled and worried for the future. And so for me, he's been going on this path of ever surer that his purpose is what he would say is good, whilst being more and more aware of the idea of some darkness being in Middle Earth. And I think we hear him use the word Sauron with Tom Bombadil, but I never felt that he has got a vision of what that means. I don't think he has connected that to the Maya of Sauron that he must have had interaction with and huge amounts of knowledge with through eternity, whether that was at the stage of, you know, Sauron being Melkor's lieutenant, you know, or right
Yes.
back of time. You know, I don't think the stranger has found that level of conscious understanding of Sauron yet, but he definitely has this understanding of, there's something in the pit of his stomach, or that, you know, there's a shadow sort of cast over his being, you know. And so this, when you talked about the naming and the different way that Sauron uses his name, yeah, you're absolutely right. We've seen Sauron all season 2, haven't we, using his name as a way of being, it's like a bulldozer for him. It's like the first point of saying, this is how I'm going to get what I want. I'm going to terrify you by revealing myself. Or you think you've only got one to worry about. I've got many names. You know, I might be this version. I might be this version of Sauron. I might be this version. And all of these are ways that I can control and manipulate. So I think it's really a lovely question. And I think my short answer is, I think I've been doing exactly what you're suggesting, but in a sort of metaphysical way. But I love that it might have come through, resonated for you in the real world way of you know, what we call people and how we refer to people and who chooses what they're called and how that portrays them, you know, going forward in societies.
Absolutely. The impression that I got as he was speaking now as well is you get these very deliberate contrast. Well, they're not deliberate, they may not be conscious on the part of the stranger, Gandalf, but certainly he's humble and learns from the Harfoots. Sauron imposes his wisdom. He kind of forces it into people's circumstances by tempting them with
Mm,
their kind of hidden desires. And the disclosure of the names is very different. Of course, he uses his name, as you rightly mentioned, kind of a manner to control. And as you mentioned, the connection between Gandalf and the natural world, of course, there's the secret fire that Tom Bombadil refers to that
yeah,
Gandalf will not be master of, and Tom Bombadil chastises him for that, but he'll have access to it.
yeah,
That's been placed in the world by Eru.
yeah.
That contrasts to the artifice and the mechanization of the rings of power themselves
Yes,
in a
that's
way that Tolkien, that's perfectly Tolkienian, if I can say.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. I love that. I love that because what's so fascinating having this conversation is that for lots of the press section, obviously we tend to only really relate to our storylines and talk about the way that our storyline has progressed, or the things that we have experienced that storyline. And whilst I get all the scripts and I read all the different storylines, I don't get to see them filming their work. So all my friends and colleagues have been going off and doing their own work. And it's only when it comes to release that we get to see the work of everybody else. So I've been experiencing the season with you all, sort of watching it at home on a telly every Thursday, and these things that I have been witnessing but haven't necessarily trickled down yet. I love that representation, like you're saying, this mechanization of the fire. The fact that the sort of the universe's biggest furnace has been sort of constructed to help. I hadn't picked up on how these things, they're absolutely the antithesis of understanding sort of following the flow of the sacred fire. They're a way of trying to harness and control. And I think that's where the stranger's been going wrong, isn't it? That's where he hasn't learned yet. And I think that's really true for lots of relational interactions we have in sort of human society, isn't it? That our immaturity, and I definitely have been slow, I think, emotionally to mature. I feel like I'm really catching up. Sometimes I may have said this to you already, but I sort of find myself wondering why at 47 I'm only just understanding this, or why I hadn't thought of that possibility before.
I can relate to that.
Right, right. And in a way, it's brilliant that we're recognizing those things. But on the other hand, you think, well, what was I doing for the rest of my life? Presumably trying to control it all, presumably seeing something, and rather than really understanding and accepting it, trying to say, well, actually, I want it to conform to my shape that I think it should be, and that is the problem, isn't it? Because nothing's going to do that either in our world or in theirs. Apart from, I mean, Sauron does a pretty good job of making it happen, but fingers crossed, somewhere in the third age that'll come to an end.
Well, that's right. That's what we've seen happening. We anticipate happening, of course, and
Yeah,
that resonates, of course, with Tolkien's Catholicism. Some of the themes that we're speaking about, either giving oneself up to providence and
yeah,
allowing, God to take charge, or, definitely Sauron is a demonic character insofar as he exemplifies that kind of, wanting control. We want control about the little things in our lives, and hopefully we learn from our mistakes, but he's wanting control of the entire Middle Earth, so that makes
yeah.
him fit the
And
mold.
and the idea, I think, that the stranger is really only just beginning to learn, but Sauron has gone the other way with about control, which is that I think there is a relationship, isn't there, between how much we are capable of withstanding seduction, or how much we are capable of being truthful to our beliefs and values and continuing to live on that path, whilst other very, very seductive or inviting opportunities present themselves. And so you get a character, certainly in the books, where Gandalf appears, much later in his journey, although for all those thousands of years of experience, he is still humble and has enough humility to acknowledge that if this, in this case, the One Ring, if this ring is placed too close to his possession, he fears that even with all his life experience, he might not be immune from its seductive power. And I think that for me the wonderful place of acceptance. It's going, yeah, you know what, the process is not to try and learn so much that I can relax because I know it all, i.e., it conforms to the thing I know. But actually, the thing is to learn so much that you know you will never know it all. And in that point, you have to be sensitive enough to understand that every opportunity that comes up, you know, is an opportunity for a fall as well as a sort of as a thing of wonder. And that's where I suppose he and we can get around the idea of pride. I think, you know, when you look at him in season 2, episode 2, when the stranger creates this massive sandstorm, I think the germ of that sandstorm comes from the right place. It comes from a recognition that the Harfoots are in trouble, his friends are in trouble. He's got this resonance back to season 1 where the same thing was happening, and he managed to find a really authentic way of banishing the mystics who were creating the danger. And I think in this moment, he thinks, I'll do that again, I'll do that again. And in that very moment of thinking, I'll do that again, i.e., I'll recreate it, what he's really doing is trying to take this new situation, which is entirely unique, and squish it into the shape of the mystics situation, and as if those two things are exactly interchangeable. And because they're not the same thing, and he's not relating to it properly in the present, he doesn't understand it. And you see his pride build. You see as this sandstorm gets stronger, he thinks, I'm doing it, and it's there. It's just there that the sort of seductive power is. And doesn't it feel good? And he goes, yes, it does feel good. And suddenly it's gone. You know,
well, I mean, you portrayed that so well. I mean, you could see the kind of desperation and then the disappointment when it all goes wrong in his features, you know, and
yeah.
poor Nori and Poppy get blown away in the second episode by that.
For me as well, I've spent by that stage, I'd spent 3 years pretty intimately with Markella and Megan, who played Nori and Poppy, and forged my own friendship with them as Daniel to Markella and Megan. And so in that moment, actually, we were filming the scene in which we knew we were going to go off and part for the rest of the season. So in that moment, the loss that I felt as Daniel for getting to work with the brilliant Markella and Megan,
was great.
Was very similar to what the stranger was feeling about sort of banishing or nearly killing his best, his only friends. So it was lovely the way that art and life sort of mirrored there, and we got a sense of we were going into these unknown lands. We did all our filming of that in Tenerife, this wild landscape, and we were suddenly going into it without each other, without these other beings that had become so powerful and sort of helpful, and like I felt that triumvirate of us. We each brought a really unique skill set that the other couldn't possibly bring for themselves, and we complemented each other. And so to be without that help was a massive thing, both for the characters, but also for me as an actor going forward and meeting Tom Bombadil, having to interact with a brand new character without them. So I love the way that worked out. Yeah.
What did you think about the interpolation of Tom Bombadil into the Stranger's arc? I mean, that is something that we don't see in the canon, but
Yeah.
I think it works. I'd like you to elaborate on it, especially in relation to, and I'm not sure if I'm getting this correct. He's following that celestial symbol in the sky, the stranger, and to me it looked like this, the runic G that was placed on
Yeah.
Bilbo's door.
Yes.
I don't know if I'm wrong or if I shouldn't have opened my mouth,
No, I
but
think it's a lovely confluence. Was it intended? Was it not? Was it just a remarkable coincidence? It definitely has something about it, doesn't it? One of the lines is sort of slightly less uppish.
That's right. Yeah.
It's sort of, it could be. And I think, sorry, I feel I've cut your question off. You were sort of mid-flow, but you were asking me about Tom.
Well, this is definitely Tom's been placed there as another guide to Gandalf. So, I mean, as the stranger, he was being guided by the Harfoots, and that's a testament to his humility with those surges of pride as he's accessing that power in the natural world that you so eloquently articulated. But then he becomes the disciple for however, we'll see how it unfolds in season 3, however brief a period of time, to Tom Bombadil, who was missing from, of course, Peter Jackson's famous trilogy. I know Rings of Power is different, but it aesthetically evokes Jackson's work, and I think in an elegant way, which kind of maintains its separateness, but sort of matches it as well. So what did you think about the inclusion of Tom Bombadil and relating him to Gandalf specifically?
Well, it's really
That's my
interesting.
question.
It's really interesting to hear that from you about the idea that in fact Tom is a guide. I had never. I don't think the stranger had realised that. That was all happening sort of step by step. It was rather muddy, I think, for him, because so many of the interactions with Tom were unsettling and discombobulating.
That's
I
right.
think that Tom is so far ahead of the stranger in terms of what he knows and understands. And I go back to that nice analogy for me of the Harfoots feeling like the core of the stranger. But then when he meets Tom Bombadil, the Harfoots microcosm of this particular set of landscapes within Middle Earth appears suddenly very small, because not only does Tom Bombadil know of that little micro system, he also knows about the whole of Middle Earth, but he also knows about the whole of the universe, but he also knows about time all the way forwards and all the way backwards. And so Tom Bombadil's sphere is absolutely enormous. And the heart of this, for the stranger, suddenly become this really tiny sort of globe of existence. And part of the difficulty for the stranger, I think, is how much he can keep them present and keep seeing them in the vastness. We go out, sometimes when you look over these massive vistas and stuff, it can be difficult to get perspective on other things. When we stood above some of the landscapes in Tenerife, we'd look out over this vast landscape, desert landscape, and we'd be on a cliff, and we'd see the route that the characters were going to take down this cliff and along the sort of base and bottom. And we would feel that we knew what scale everything was down there. And then we'd see some people. It was a national park area, so we'd see some tourists walking through this park, and suddenly you'd realize quite how vast that plateau was. I'd have thought that it would take us, maybe it'd take us a few hours to get to there, but then you saw the size of the actual people, and when you really looked at them, you saw that they were going over what looked like mountains themselves, even though when you zoomed out, it looked almost flat, but they were going over massive sort of ups and downs. So that I say all this because I think for the stranger, he can't possibly comprehend what Tom is, and it's maybe too easy for us to call Tom a guide. I don't want to speak for Rory too much, but when I interviewed with Rory and I heard how he talked about it, he rather felt that Tom was interacting with things that came his way. He had come to Rune to see what was going on, why the water had dried up, why the plants were struggling to grow. What was at the bottom of, maybe he felt that thing about energy as well, that he felt some darkness in the energy grid, and he'd sort of come to try and understand what was going on, not to solve it, but just to see it, to know it, to acknowledge it, to be curious about. And so when the stranger comes into that sphere, Rory said a lovely thing that whilst it could appear that he was trying to guide the stranger, actually he always felt that he was watching. He was watching. He didn't ever give a right or a wrong answer. He asked lots of questions. He demonstrated lots of, wonderfully whimsical things. But ultimately, if the stranger had made different choices, Tom wouldn't have interjected. He would have seen this cycle. This would have been part of what was happening in Rune. This might have been part of why Rune was struggling so badly, or, but it was to watch and it was to understand. And I loved that idea because it becomes less linear then. It becomes more, well, Tom stays in that territory of the Tolkien stories where
still removed somehow, a god of his own garden, but not really interfering too directly. Yeah.
And God's own garden is such a beautiful phrase, because how on earth has he managed to make a kitchen garden in a place?
That's right. That's right.
It's extraordinary. But yeah, so I loved playing it like that, and internally, we didn't really get to see it massively, but inside his house, the artwork, the creativity that had gone into that set was truly astounding. They had this rock ceiling, and there were crevices that went up right to the sky through the rock ceiling, and there were star maps. The chimney was these sort of continuous candles that seemed to have been burnt for eternity, and they could be all lit by him in one fell swoop. The animals, and even when we were filming, this idea of working with animals and control. It's true again. There was a scene where I had to follow a goat. The goat was meant to, in the script, it was meant to walk me to Tom Bombadil, and of course, when we tried to do it, the goat was just I'm not walking into Tom Bombadil. I'm stopping right here. And I'd sort of try and they are incredibly strong. I don't know how much you know about goats, but I'd never worked with a
Not
goat.
much.
I was no shifting this goat. I tried talking, it couldn't move the thing. So again, that sort of acceptance. But I really enjoyed filming those scenes largely because they set the stranger who had largely, he had been free in a way to have these emotional outbursts in season one, which impacted on the surrounding landscape and community. But in season two, when he meets Tom Bombadil, I feel like there's another being that is sort of switching places with him, and now he's got to respond to these outbursts. It so happens that the person creating the outbursts understands them and is, maybe in line with the sacred fire, but for the stranger, it's really, really unsettling, and it's sort of, I think this is why, he could go in multiple different directions depending on how he responds to those things. At one point he says, come on, I've just seen the magic you can do. I want to learn how to do that like you. And
yes, I remember.
That feels like that he's back on the tightrope of that's not the way, that's not the acceptance I give you. That definitely Tom Bombadil does sit him down and talk about the sacred.
Like a Socratic midwife, kind of giving him the nudges without necessarily
Yeah.
forcing him to. Well, another thing that you mentioned, Daniel. Honestly, I'm enjoying your reflections so much, but I think we're running out of time, so I'll get this last question across, if I may.
Yeah.
This process. Because there are many, for our Catholic readers in the Catholic Weekly, many Christs distributed throughout the Lord of the Rings. That's where the notion of guidance kind of came from, but also in the Stranger or Gandalf's journey, he kind of comes from heaven, he lands on Earth. Eventually, he'll begin his ministry, if you like, at the beginning of the Third Age later on. And he ends up fighting the Balrog and in the underworld and resurrecting as Gandalf the White. We know that. But just to make a connection between the Rings of Power and later the Lord of the Rings of Two Towers, you've got this amnesiac journey after your coming to Earth, let's say, as a stranger, as an incarnate Istar. And then you see that also depicted all in the books and, of course, by Sir Ian McKellen so wonderfully when he descends into the abyss with the Balrog of Morgoth in the mines of Moria, and he rises as Gandalf the White, but he doesn't really recall Gandalf the Grey. Did you draw upon that at all in your performance, or is it something that you tried to consciously steer away from?
No, neither of those actually. I think that I was so enamored with the early parts of playing the character in season one, where I didn't know. I mean, they hadn't even made it clear that he was in Istar. That they wanted me to walk that line, I think, authentically of good and evil, of light and dark, and they wanted me as the actor playing the character to find these moments where it was incredibly seductive to be able to conjure with fireflies and take their life at the same time, or create massive winds, which were all done practically. So both I as the actor and the stranger as the character were having these effects, and I think they wanted me to, or they were very happy that I was going through this journey, sort of looking at people going, well, this is incredibly amazing, and I've got to be a bit careful. You're all right. Do you need goggles, for the wind? But also going, look at what I'm being entrusted with. I can make 85, I don't know what the unit of wind power is, but I can have all these wind turbines turning on at the same time, and that kind of intoxication with the power so mirrors the Stranger's tightrope of definitely the first and largely the second season as well, that I think I never worried too much about where it was going. I just was so enjoying playing these scenes, and I trusted that the showrunners had a destination that they wanted to get to, but that really my job was to, if I committed to the present, if I committed with all my energy, all my heart, all my integrity to immerse myself in that world that I was given, then and I played it as honestly as I could, then the future would be taking care of itself. And so any allusion to things that we know happen in the books later on, they're wonderfully coincidental for me. I love the fact that people might see things in them, but I definitely didn't try to do that. And that's probably the good writing rather than necessarily my performance. But it's lovely to hear people draw resonances and see analogies in things like that. Because the name thing came very late on, certainly through the second season, I didn't know that they were going to take him, and sort of allow him to become Gandalf in the second season. So most of the time, I was trying to just be present with that storyline and commit to it as much as possible.
Well, it comes through, and congratulations. It's been a hell of a ride. I had the the advanced screenings for the last 2 episodes. Of course, watching them under lock and key and all of that kind of thing, and I enjoyed them immensely, and I recommend it very much to anybody who loves Tolkien or not. It's just very thrilling to see how things transpire at a Region, and also with Gandalf. It's just amazing. Thank you so much, Daniel, for your time.
And it's been lovely finally to be able to get to talk about it, because I haven't talked about the Gandalf storyline or any of these real storylines in season 2 and up until press. And so you are all the first people that I'm allowed to talk to about it. And it's a lovely sort of soaring moment for my heart to get back in touch with the stranger and know that people are receiving it, or that it is landing in whatever way they choose to take it. So thanks for your words as well.
Pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you. Right.